Hey everyone, you are listening to the fourth episode in the ClassofHC 2016 Election Clapback podcast. It's a series that was inspired by a good book that I read this summer, and a series that's also been provoked by a lot of the foolishness that we have all seen in this year's presidential campaign in the U.S. I am Deji, the host of the Class of Hope and Change documentary. You can find out more about that project at ClassofHC.com. So we've already talked about the state of the history of American corporations. We've talked about capitalism a little bit in the free market and kind of how we ended up with this system as you currently know it in terms of the economy. We talked about how they started. We talked about big businesses. Last time we talked about workers and Labor Day and most of the basics about the things that most of us take for granted in terms of our working conditions, where those things actually came from. Because I think it's important to look at what was going on in America at the time when a certain segment of our population, a large segment, enthusiastic segment of our population, they look at certain periods of history in our country as points in time that they want to go back to. So I think it's important to take a look back at some of those times and see what was actually going on. For those who are listening to this podcast for the first time, thanks for listening. This series, like I said, was inspired by a really good book that I read this summer. It's called Economix by Michael Goodwin and Dan Burr. The book is like a comic book version of American history that focuses on telling the story of the country's economy. Very easy read. I don't know the authors for the book. I'm not promoting it or any part of press for them, but the book inspired this podcast, so I'm always trying to get folks to read. So I think it's a good book. Check out the link in the description, and you can find out more information about that book if you choose to take a look at that. In episode 3, we left off talking about the struggles and fights of workers who were organizing to demand and negotiate better working conditions with the corporations they worked for. And we were kind of talking about the period from 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, and 20s. So in 1910, the book picks up, the book Economix, which again is I'm picking up little reference points from here and there to talk about things I feel like are relevant in our current election. So around 1910, Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Company, the founder, changed the game, the whole game of like how businesses relate to their workers by building a car that was designed for the average American worker to be able to afford. That was kind of a relatively new concept. Until then, cars had been like a super luxury. And he also paid his workers enough to be able to afford the car that they made. That also, too, at the time was a revolutionary concept and not something that a lot of people who ran big businesses thought was necessary. Remember, at the time, as we talked about, you had businesses that were fighting workers' goal of getting 8-hour work schedules, of getting higher pay, and using armies and sometimes the actual governmental military forces to fight back against those who were protesting for that. So when Henry Ford comes along and talks about paying people enough to buy his products and only giving them 8-hour work shift, people just didn't know what to do with that, at least folks who had power at the time. So I want to give you a sense of the pay. So he paid his workers $5 a day at the time. So at the time, like that was a revolutionary concept. A car, the car that they made, the first Ford car, the Model T, sold for around $300. So we're talking 3 months, basically, if you assume people, not working on the weekends, 3 months and you could buy the car cash based on an average worker's salary. Again, that's revolutionary. Think about what your company and the service that you provide. Think about how many workers make the things, particularly workers around the globe who make the things that we all buy, and how long it would take them based on what companies pay them to actually purchase the things that we purchase here. So I just want to stay with this idea of the pay a little bit. I think it's really important and profound when you just work some basic numbers out to think about where we stand right now in our country and where we stood then. So again, Henry Ford pays his workers $5 a day in $1910, revolutionary idea at the time. Just to give you a sense of where that stands, $5 a day back then is about $120 a day now, which means that an average worker working for Ford making a car, Model T, because they only made one car at the time, made about $600 a week in today's dollars, or about $2,400 a month in today's dollars. And if you work that out, we're talking $29,000 a year. So again, in 1910, if you bring the dollars forward, accounting for inflation and everything, the person making cars made about $30,000 a year. To give you some context, in the U.S. in 2014, which is the last time, some of the most recent data, the U.S. Census is the organization, the governmental department that tracks this stuff, 33% of households made $33,000 or less. So again, 1910, if you bring the money forward, average worker for Ford makes $29,000 a year in today's dollars. Today, just about a third of our country makes less than a worker working for Ford made 100 years ago. So that stuns me. I don't know if that stuns you, but I think that is definitely an election clapback type of issue, which deserves a much longer conversation some point during the next 2 months in this country. Is how is it that, I'm going to say anyone makes less than someone did 100 years ago, but certainly how is it that a third of all working people, households by the way, which may include more than one adult, make less than a person making the first Ford car made in 1910? Profound discussion. If you have any ideas on that, please reach out to us at ClassofHC or ClassofHC@gmail.com. Would love to hear some of your thoughts on that. So back to the story. Again, starting in the 1910s and 20s, you have competition to Ford. So like I said, Ford was an innovator in the assembly line in getting the cost of making a car down so that he could sell it at a price that was affordable for his own workers, at paying his workers enough to be able to afford the car. But he did have a shortcoming, is that he only thought that you only need to make one type of car. So every year he made the same model car. Again, an idea that for us today seems just ridiculous, that nothing would change at all in a car, no types of improvements. But when you're the only person making a car, that's what you can do. Remember, we talked about in episode 1. If you have not listened to that, definitely go back and check that out. But we talked about Adam Smith and the free market and some of his ideas about, if someone is not providing a proper service, someone should be able to compete with them. And that's what happened. So you have companies like Chevrolet, Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, and they form what we now know as GM or General Motors, right? And so they start to compete with Ford. They start making different kinds of cars and cars that look different and begin to cater to Americans who wanted something different. Many Americans were driving for the first time ever around the 1910s and 20s. Also, the book Economix speaks about one of the most important innovations to happen in the last 100 years, which is the idea of consumer credit. We use credit cards today and we're very familiar with credit now, but at that time, for most people, the average person who wasn't wealthy or connected or powerful, you could only buy what you could pay with cash, right? But with the idea and the creation of consumer credit, you could borrow money from a bank through the store for things like cars, washing machines, furnitures, and you could pay the bank back through installment payments, a system that we still have today. And obviously you'd be paying the original amount plus interest over the next months or years. So look around your house. Think about the things in your life and think about how many of them you purchased with a credit card or with a loan or that you bought with a payment plan. And how much would you have if you could only buy things that you had to pay with cash that you actually earned from, whatever it is you do. And so consumer credit becomes one of the most important ideas and fundamental to growth in America. So it wasn't that everybody was necessarily making a lot of money, but the importance of being able to borrow, foundational to our country. So Americans felt better about their lives. At least many more of them did. In 1 or 2 generations, a lot of people went from living on a farm to being able to drive a car, to buying new appliances that were being invented, and having many more creature comforts than their parents or grandparents knew, especially after World War II, when the government created suburbs and began providing incentives for people to be able to buy homes. People were coming up. Except for the Depression and the World Wars, people looked around during most of the period of the early 20th century and felt like they had things way better than their parents and grandparents when America was great. Which brings me to the last topic in this episode. One of the ridiculous and sad tragedies of many of the debates in this country, at least to me, occurs whenever someone, usually attempting to defend the status quo of a given situation in our country, begins to speak like the only thing that matters right now is whatever was happening while they were alive or their families have lived in this country. You often hear this argument framed around the "I wasn't around for such and such activity" argument. This sort of thing is absurd to me, and part of the reason why I started this Election Clapback podcast. To give you an example, if I jumped into a discussion about Game of Thrones and started saying that all seasons matter, and why do they keep focusing on winter? Why does everything have to be about winter? I'd be relegated to the side of the conversation at least. If I showed up to a sports conversation, particularly football, I'm recording this episode when the NFL season is thankfully back. If I was to enter a conversation about sports and football and ask why we keep talking about Green Bay Why is Green Bay so important to football fans when their town only represents 0.03% of the nation's population? Why should anyone care about the football team that is playing in that town? I would get laughed out of a football conversation. If I was going to tell the history of Major League Baseball by only talking about the Chicago White Sox, that would be absurd. Right? You're not allowed in sports, in entertainment, in much of life to speak without context. And yet, for some reason in our social and political discussions, we allow all sorts of people to speak without context. This effort, this election clapback effort, is part of an opportunity, I feel like, to speak the way we talk about everything else, to try to learn as much about the characters in the story that matter. We do this with our cars. You know your Carfax, you know the history of your car, where it's been, how many people have driven it, what accidents it's been in, you know the history of your home, many of you, who lived there before, how many kids they had, what was the situation like. Many of you know your own family history. You know the history of your town, your college, the high school you went to, your state. And so likewise, for me, I feel it's important to talk about the history of this country in detail, in the same detail that we give to our favorite celebrities, our favorite movies, our favorite sports team. I'm encouraging you to not turn off that side of your brain when it comes to issues that may challenge your understanding, just as you would not be allowed to if you wanted to talk about a lot of other things in America. And so to help with that, as we talk about when America was great, I'm just going to read a few quotes from some leading scholars and figures at the time who were there, who lived through it, who some of us are aware of, many of us may not be aware of. I present them without commentary. Feel free to go to your local library and get on Google and learn more about these people. But I'm going to try to do this a few times throughout this podcast series just to introduce some new thoughts for many people. And people can reckon with these thoughts. I present them without commentary. Some other people, we'll call them eyewitnesses, who were present during this period of 1910s and 1920s when America was great. Quote number 1. Quote, "That we suffer so much today, under whatsoever flag we live, is proof positive that constitutions and laws, when framed by the early advocates of human liberty, never included and were never intended for us as a people. It is only a question of sheer accident that we happen to be fellow citizens today with the descendants of those who, through their advocacy, laid the foundation for human rights." End quote. Marcus Garvey. Number 2. There is something about poverty that smells like death. Dead dreams dropping off the heart like leaves in a dry season and rotting around the feet. Impulses smothered too long in the fetid air of underground caves. The soul lives in sickly air. People can be slave ships in shoes. End quote. Zora Neale Hurston. Number 3. Quote, "Equality is the heart and essence of democracy. Freedom and justice, equality of opportunity in industry, in labor unions, schools and colleges, government, politics, and before the law. There must be no dual standards of justice, no dual rights, privileges, duties, or responsibilities of citizenship. No dual forms of freedom." End quote. A. Philip Randolph. Number 4. Perhaps the most extraordinary characteristic of current America is the attempt to reduce life to buying and selling. Life is not love unless love is sex and bought and sold. Life is not knowledge save knowledge of technique, of science for destruction. Life is not beauty except beauty for sale. Life is not art unless its price is high and it is sold for profit. All life is production for profit, and for what is profit but for buying and selling again. End quote. W.E.B. Du Bois. Number 5. Quote, "The American Negro must rebuild his past in order to make his future. Though it is orthodox to think of America as one country where it is unnecessary to have a past, what is a luxury for the nation as a whole becomes a prime social necessity for the Negro. For him, a group tradition must supply compensation for persecution, and pride of the race the antidote for prejudice. History must restore what slavery took away, for it is the social damage of slavery that the present generation must repair and offset. End quote. Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. Number 6. Last one. Quote, history shows that it does not matter who is in power or what revolutionary forces take over the government. Those who have not learned to do for themselves and have to depend solely on others never obtain any more rights or privileges in the end than they had in the beginning. End quote. Carter G. Woodson. There are many more important names and stories and voices and witness accounts of what happened during this first period when America was great. I definitely would look forward to hearing the ones that stand out to you all in this moment. Which ones do you think can inform us in this conversation, help us think about what's happening in this election clapback season? Definitely reach out to us at ClassofHC@gmail.com with your favorite ones. Would love to read those out and share those with the broader public. Also, you can reach out to us on social media. Please use the hashtag Election Clapback. We're trying to look for a space and trying to create a space where people of goodwill and good sense can have a different conversation than the one that is being shown to us right now, particularly on our cable television. So if you've got goodwill and good sense, definitely reach out to us. We're looking to continue the conversation. Next time, we'll talk about when America wasn't so great. Thanks again for listening. Have a great one.